Filters make a lot of great visual effects much easier to do, but they are something of a work in progress, so in this video I'll cover what they are, how to use them, and some of the improvements Yo-Yo Games have said are coming in the future. Filters are really nothing more than a pre-built shader. You can even look at the underlying code if you want. They take things that are drawn or are being drawn and modify how they look. Using filters in the room editor is easy. Click the Create New Filter Effect Layer button in the Layers panel, drag it to where you want, and name it. Then select the effect type and settings you want for that effect type. As it currently stands, filters affect every layer below them. So this filter will change the look of all of these layers below it and leave all of the layers above it unaffected. One very important thing to note here is that if you are manually changing layers or depths in code, for example with something like depth equals -y, you might see some unusual results as you could possibly move something in or out of the filter's effect by changing its depth. Although what you can do with a filter in the room editor is limited, I found a number of simple but nice uses for them. For example, in this project, I'm blurring my moving background. You can also access and change filters in code. You can do more with them this way than you can in the room editor, but this is also where the problems start. But before we get to those problems, let's cover the basics. GameMaker provides you with these functions to interact with your filters through code. There aren't very many, so if you want to use filters in code, it's worth reading through all of them. They let you do things like create or destroy filters, turn them on or off, and modify their variables while your game is running. To use filters in code, we need a slightly better understanding of how they work. As I said at the start, they're ultimately pre-built shaders, but between your code and the shader there is an intermediate layer which we can think of as a struct applied to a room layer. So we use the built-in functions to interact with this fx struct, which the GameMaker engine then uses to interact with the shader. We can create these structs either directly in the room editor or through the function fxCreate. If we create it in the room editor, we don't need to do anything else, but if you create a filter using fxCreate, you also need to assign it to a layer with fxSet. You can see an example of this here. First, I create an fx struct by using fxCreate, then I set its parameter, or in this case, just the intensity, and then I use layerSetFX to apply this new struct to a layer so it actually does something. It's important to note that for you to do this, the effect actually has to exist in at least some room somewhere, otherwise it won't work. And in this project, I just added the effect to an empty room. It's also important to note that the name of the effect isn't always the same as what it is actually called in the room editor. So for example, I'm creating the desaturate effect, but it's called filter grayscale. You can get the true name of a filter by placing one in the room editor and then calling fxGetName on it, either in debug mode or with a show debug message. This is one of those things that makes filters feel a bit like a work in progress, but it is what it is right now. We can also get access to an existing effect struct with this function, layerGetFX. Once we have access to the struct, we can change variables in that struct directly with fxSetParameter. So for example here, I'm getting the struct on the blur effect layer, and then based upon whether this variable, blur active, is true or not, setting the value of the blur radius with fxSetParameter. Note that the parameter name is always a string. And I'll talk more about how to get this parameter name in a moment, but for now, just assume that we know it. You can also get a parameter struct from the effect struct with fxGetParameters, and you can then set values in that parameter struct the way you normally set values in a struct, and then apply that whole struct back to the effect struct with fxSetParameters. You can see an example of this here. I'm getting the struct itself with layerGetFX, then I'm getting the parameter struct with fxGetParameters, then I'm changing values in that parameter struct with a dot accessor, and then I'm applying that whole parameter struct back to the effect struct with fxSetParameters. Personally, I prefer the first method of directly setting values with fxSetParameter, but both work. And this is just about everything you need to know to have full control over the filters in code, but for one small detail. All of this only works if you know what these variable names are and what type of variable they are. And the manual doesn't tell you either. Fortunately, you can figure them both out, but it's a bit annoying. The first way to try and figure them out is to guess. They follow a mostly consistent naming practice, so if you look at the variable names in the room editor and then add a G underscore to it, removing any spaces, that will probably work. However, some variables follow a different naming practice. For example, you can see that tint color becomes tint col. So the second, more annoying but more accurate way to figure out a variable's name is to run the game in debug mode with a call to fxGetParameters and fxGetParameterNames. So I've run the debugger and stopped on this line. We get our fx struct with the function layerGetFX. This is a blank struct that won't show you anything, but we can then use that struct with fxGetParameters, which gives us that parameter struct. You can expand it in the debugger to see both the names of the variables as well as their type, either a number or an array. And if we call the function fxGetParameterNames, you can see the string version that you need to use. Note that there are only 2 names because g_tintColor is an array with 4 positions. The manual goes into greater depth here, but for an array, you can either change the array as normal if you are modifying the parameter struct directly like I'm doing here, or you can pass in an array or separate arguments if using the function fxSetParameter. Using the debugger like this should answer all of your questions, but there is a third way, and that is to go look at the shader code itself. This way is also fairly annoying, but it has the advantage of not requiring you to run the game to figure it out. You can find the underlying shader code at C Program Data, GameMaker Studio 2, Cache, Runtimes, the specific runtime, bin, and finally filters and effects. Here you can see all of the filters and you can go into them, again go through a couple folders, and then open the shader code. You can look at all 3 of these, but the one that you want is the FSH file. You can open it with any text editor. There are 2 things to look for. First, the name, which in GameMaker needs to be a string, but will otherwise be the exact same. And second, the type. If you see float or int, that will be a number, while any vector or vec2, vec3, vec4 will be an array of that many positions. So if you don't want to run the game in debug mode, you can go open this up and make a note of what you find, or keep it open somewhere, just probably don't mess with the actual file. Yo-Yo Games has said a couple things about what is coming for shaders. In a post on the forum, they said that this feature will continue to grow with the ability to specify your own filters and effects, applying filters and effects to a specific layer rather than all layers below the effect layer, adding a filter effect layer to a sequence, and also applying filters and effects to a specific area of a sequence. All of which sound great, and I think will make filters even more usable. Though I really hope that they figure out a way to make the variable names and types visible without running the debugger or navigating to some code in their folders. If you want more examples of interesting ways to use filters, check out this article by Matthew of GameMaker Station on the official GameMaker website, or this video by 1UpIndie on how to use filters to create a pixel transition.